We'll get started. Thank you everyone so much for being here. In way of introductions, I'm Patricia Thane. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Private AI, backgrounds in research and privacy and natural language processing. And really happy to have Bruce join us here today. And Bruce, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, my name's Bruce Fairley. I'm the founder of the Tech Narrative Group. And prior to the Tech Narrative Group, I was the Chief Technology Officer of Loblaw Companies. Before that, Shoppers Drug Mart. And before that, I worked for a German-based pharmaceutical company in Germany called Boehringer Ingelheim. And so today I'm excited to talk with Patricia about privacy in the healthcare space. Great.
Great. So we'll be going over what health data is, why it's so hard to secure it, what the case is for clinical trials, and the potential and challenges of AI in healthcare. So what is health data? We'll give you an exact definition here. It has been defined in multiple legislations. Protected health information, PHI, is any information in the medical record or designated record set that can be used to identify an individual and that was created, used, or disclosed in the course of providing a healthcare service, such as a diagnosis or treatment. And one place where we see PHI defined is also HIPAA, where there are 18 different entity types that are given as examples, including names, addresses, email addresses, license plates, IP addresses, dates. Many of these can be direct identifiers, which will directly or almost directly identify an individual within a certain statistical likelihood of re-identification. Some of them can be indirect identifiers, but things like dates, for example, count as indirect identifiers, which when combined together can exponentially increase the risk of re-identifying an individual. And this is it's very difficult to deal with PHI across healthcare data for multiple reasons. How you deal with PHI within healthcare data really depends on the use case that you're currently tackling. Do you need any statistical representations of the PHI in order to be able to do research? Do you need to remove remove the PHI completely? What kind of healthcare data do you need to keep in itself? And oftentimes you're dealing with a huge amount of data. It's very messy. The standard format of the data might not always be the same. And you often might even have multilingual data to deal with, whether it be because you live in a multilingual country, or maybe because you're dealing with multinational records. And a lot of the times also, how you think about PHI and re-identifiability can also depend on the context that you're dealing with within the texts that you're processing.
Thanks, Patricia. I mean, it's really helpful, but let's take a little bit of a step back, I think, right? And if we take a little bit of a step back, we start to, when we start thinking about healthcare information in general, and so why are we doing clinical trials in the first place, right? And ultimately, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to demonstrate through clinical evidence, ultimately, that a compound does what we say it's going to do. Right. I mean, every drug company, that's what their core focus is improving healthcare outcomes. And they're doing so by, creating compounds, distributing compounds, but they're doing it in a way where, the guarantee from a pharmaceutical company is that every single dose is exactly the same. It's going to behave in exactly the same way. And ultimately, we have to prove to the regulators that we have done that successfully. Right. And so there's lots of different stakeholders here, right? So you've got the trial participants, you've got the CROs, you've got the pharmaceutical organizations, and then obviously you have the regulators that are overseeing everything. Right. And so when we think about this long-running process of discovering a compound and bringing it to market, there is just so much data that's collected. Right. And that data can be structured data, it could be semi-structured data, it can be unstructured data. But there's just a tremendous amount of it, and it's collected in a number of different types of technologies, right? And the way the pharmaceutical industry works is, as everybody on the call probably knows, is we start with simple and we get more and more complex. So when we first start working with a particular drug, a particular compound, we're going to start entering into like a phase 1 trial. And when we do those phase 1 trials and those phase 2 trials, we're not dealing with a lot of people. Right? We're dealing with a very, very few set of people, right? And we're really, really controlling the process, right? But as we gain confidence that the drug and the compound is doing what we want it to do, that it's actually producing the positive health outcomes that we're looking for, then we increase the complexity, we increase the participants, right? And all of this takes a lot of time, right? And when we're doing these types of things, like when you start with phase 1, we might be dealing with 10, 20, 40 people. But when we get into a phase 3 clinical trial just before you getting your notice of compliance, you may be dealing with thousands of people, right? 20,000, 30,000 participants, right? And so managing that volume of people through this process is extremely difficult, right? Now, even when we do that, ultimately, we're also doing some other things to make sure that we have integrity of the data. So we're doing single-blinded studies. We might be doing a double-blinded study. And when we do that, the whole point of those things is to remove bias. It's to remove the visibility of the placebo effect, right? And so we can actually truly demonstrate that it's doing what we said it was going to do, right? And that's ultimately what we want, right? Everybody in the healthcare industry wants to improve health outcomes. And so if that's the whole point of improving health outcomes, we've got this problem, right? And this problem is efficacy and safety versus privacy, right? And those things are in conflict. And so we need to acknowledge that they're a little bit in conflict because are we willing to give up privacy for the betterment of everybody? And I think the answer is it depends. And in some cases, we're not. In some cases, we might be willing to do it a little bit, right? And so, the FDA has been pretty clear on this kind of stuff, right? So the FDA's come out and basically said, like, look, if you want to submit clinical trial evidence, you want to submit clinical evidence to the FDA to get a drug approved. And why does everybody care about the FDA? Well, it's because the US is the largest drug market in the world. So everybody wants to be in the US, right? They want to be selling their product in the US. The FDA basically says, look, if you want to have approval, you can do it. But at the end of the day, every single piece of evidence that you collect, you also need to demonstrate that the technology that you're using to collect it, you have control of. The data can't be tampered with. It can't have been manipulated or stolen, or anything malicious cannot have happened to it. Right? Now, that whole process, all the pharmaceutical organizations know full and well, is CSV&C, right? Computer systems validation and compliance, right? And so on a technical level, that whole process establishes the trust between a regulator and the process, right? And so it goes out with, I think it goes without saying that, this is a pretty complex undertaking. But at the core of it, protecting the integrity of the whole process, and protecting the integrity of the data, right? At the same time, we want to protect the privacy of the patient. When we start thinking about this, one thing is clear, and that is that every pharmaceutical company that is working in industry today has done its very best to keep these checks and balances in place, right? The problem is that in doing so, it's creating, I would say, with either current or yesterday's technology, it's creating a productivity problem. So the cost to get a drug to market is very, very high. The time it takes to get a drug to market is very, very long. And so is there newer technology that can help us increase the integrity of the data, increase the privacy of the data, right? And not lose any of our checks and balances. And so I think what you're going to hear through the course of this session is you're going to hear Patricia say, yes, there is, right? And I think you're going to hear her say, and here's how. When we start thinking about regulators overseeing the integrity of the process, and they are increasingly under scrutiny from, the general public to also be transparent. So you think about this, right? So the CROs are basically reporting into the pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical companies are basically have to be transparent with the regulator, And the regulator in this internet age is becoming increasingly under scrutiny to prove, guarantee, demonstrate that they've done their due diligence. So there's this huge transparency bandwagon that's going on here, right? And I think everybody in the pharmaceutical industry and everybody in the healthcare industry have all heard of Dr. Google, right? And so a lot of this information needs to become public, right? But in making it public and establishing that transparency, we begin to introduce that conflict again. And that conflict is, how do we make sure that we have efficacy and safety while protecting the rights and privacy of patients? Is there a way to safely manage this while ensuring that whenever we do redact something, we have the integrity to reinsert it consistently? And when I say consistently, I mean for all the pharmaceutical organizations that may be listening in here, I mean, like, can we demonstrate it from a CSV and C point of view so that the confidence and trust is established? And I think the answer is yes. Here's the thing, right? When we think about this whole process from phase 1 all the way through the phase 3, NOC, maybe there's some other trials that take place, but now the drug's publicly available. It's now available to be prescribed, it's available to be consumed, it's available to go on your treatment protocol. That's all good, but the data doesn't stop. It's not just about the clinical trial. It's also about the real world experience that we're going to get and see as the drug is available across different jurisdictions, right? And so this notion of ensuring the efficacy and safety, even once the drug is publicly available, it never goes away. It can never go away, but we still need to protect the privacy of the patient, right? So I was in the pharmaceutical industry. I was working at Boehringer, right? Right around in the early 2000s, and I was in Europe and whatnot. And I remember the impact of CSV and C being pushed really hard by the FDA. Right? I'm not going to say what happened with Vioxx, anything malicious happened. I'm not advocating or insinuating any of that in any shape or form. Right? What I am saying though is something went wrong. Something went wrong somewhere. Now the checks and balances ultimately ended up working, but I think we would all say that they worked too late in the process. Right? So, we want to make sure that, and just so for the younger folks that are on the call that may not know the Vioxx story, Vioxx was a blockbuster drug. It dealt with hypertension. It ended up, it was publicly available. It ended up being pulled from the market because it had an adverse event where it seemed in certain conditions that it was killing people, which is exactly what we do not want to have happen in the healthcare industry. Nobody wants that to have happen. And so the drug ultimately got pulled. But when it got pulled, the key thing here is how did the FDA react? How did the pharmaceutical companies react? And what they did is they took a really deep, hard look at themselves and said, how do we control this process better? How do we make sure that we have integrity to demonstrate the clinical evidence that it does have efficacy and safety, that we are protecting privacy? And so that's an example of us maybe not hitting the mark. But I think with the introduction of some newer technologies, we can not only begin to demonstrate efficacy more effectively, we can also demonstrate safety more effectively. We have clear integrity of the data and protect people's privacy. And if we can do that and improve productivity, everybody keeps talking about a win-win. So I think that's 4 wins. So I think that's pretty good.
Thank you, Bruce. And with the amount of data that you've mentioned, Bruce, that keeps growing, over 30,000 patients sometimes enrolled in clinical trials, it becomes a lot for humans to handle themselves. And right now we are in a very nice wave where AI can be applied to healthcare under certain constraints. And those constraints tend to be around where that AI is deployed, how you're training that AI or fine-tuning. And it depends specifically what kind of use cases you're deploying it in, and also what kind of data you're feeding into that AI. But overall, what can happen is you can improve patient care outcomes. You can enhance the operational efficiency of your clinical trial process as well, for example. And you can ultimately use this new technology to innovate new products much more quickly, new services much more quickly. And the really interesting part here is that the barriers to AI implementation seen across multiple industries is something that can also be seen within healthcare. And so it's being addressed at a global scale. We've got worries about bias in AI models, for example. These can be particularly concerning if, for example, in healthcare, because the outcomes for particular populations have been quite negative in medicine because there have not been representative groups in certain communities. For example, it's a well-known fact that people of color will have might not be well represented within healthcare studies the same way Caucasian people might. And if we take that bias within studies and make that available to AI models, that can make the problem even bigger than it is now. So bias, it is a concern worldwide, but it is very much a concern in healthcare because of the potential negative outcomes. One thing we have observed is that by removing quasi-identifiers like religion or information about location, in certain situations, that can reduce the level of bias within AI models. But of course, for the healthcare space, that has to be taken on a situation by situation basis. Regulatory compliance is also a barrier to AI implementation worldwide. In healthcare in particular, it's very sensitive because you've got very strict rules and very high bar to compliance, and also a very big ruler to slap you with on the wrist if you don't do the right thing. And so what makes it difficult in the case of AI implementation is because you're using AI to deal with huge amounts of data. And then how are you going to deal with that data in a regulatorily compliant way if it is just such a large amount of data that you need to deal with? So we'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. And also the AI data breaches and malicious compromises. If you are training a model for healthcare, what you need to be really conscious of is the information that you are using to train that model or fine-tune that model with can be memorized by that model. And because this is such sensitive information, you really need to be concerned about what the output of that model is going to be, and also who is going to see the output of that model. So if you were, for example, to train a chatbot on a bunch of electronic medical records, and somebody were to query what did Bruce Farley do in go for a doctor visit for 2 weeks ago, for example, you would not want to be able to see that answer. And so that kind of thing is what you have to be concerned about when it comes to AI data breaches, because it's not only the breach of the model that you're concerned about, but the data breaches that are more downstream when you are getting at inference time, getting the output of the model. And in addition to that, a few other things still need a bit of education on. For example, the fact that if you are creating embeddings, so embeddings have been very hot these days. You basically create vector representations of your data, either words or paragraphs or documents. Those embeddings can also contain personal information that you can reverse engineer. So you have to be very careful about what kind of training data you're using in order to create those embeddings.
The key thing that I'm hearing you say when you're going through those different risks and what people are concerned about is with private AI, what you're getting is a tremendous amount of control.
That's right. Yeah. So
right?
the key thing is that when you're dealing with so much information in so many different languages, And from so many different types of contexts, you can't just throw humans at the problem. That's too much work. And humans can be they can get tired. They can't you have to go find the ones that have the right training, et cetera, et cetera. It's good to have humans in the loop in general when it comes to AI in healthcare. But those very repetitive tasks, such as the identification and understanding what kind of personal information you have, that should not be solely a human's job.
That is one of the contributors to the productivity issue, right? So let's use AI in a way where we can look at the data to demonstrate efficacy, not be, making sure that we're compliant. We can let the technology make sure that we're compliant.
Exactly. So we're using AI to enable AI essentially. And of course, compliance can come in many flavors, depending on whether you're trying to be HIPAA compliant or GDPR compliant or compliant with PIPEDA or PHIPAA. But ultimately, what many of these regulations require is understanding your data, understanding what kind of information you're collecting, understanding the risk of your data, which you can do by automatically identifying the personal information that you have in there, and the protected health information, and also minimizing the amount of data that you're collecting. And that data minimization can vary with regards to requirements from legislation to legislation. Some of them is, minimize whatever and remove anything that you don't need that's personally identifiable. Some of them have that requirement of anonymization. And what does that mean with regards to HIPAA, for example? That means you can either be compliant with HIPAA safe harbor, so removing those 18 different entity types, or it means that you have to get expert determination for the kind of data that you're anonymizing. And that means you need to get an expert to say this has a low enough risk of re-identifying an individual, roughly 0.04% re-identification risk. And to get to that point, not only is it better to de-identify data automatically, especially as a first pass, given how cumbersome this is for humans to do, but it can also help go back into other data that you have de-identified and just double check, is there anything that your previous technologies or previous employees missed during the de-identification process. So that's for compliance. When it comes to things like summarization, because there's so many electronic medical records that you might have to go through, even for one single patient. You're not going to want to send that directly into any large language model in order to get that summarization without some sort of curation of the data, some sort of filtering of the data. And so it turns out that when you remove personal information from electronic medical records, but keep things like disease, keep things like maybe approximate dates, you could still get a very good summary of the information without compromising those personal identifiers. And Bruce, you had mentioned as well FDA approval and how that is top of mind for a lot of individuals. There's also a process you had talked about before in a previous chat about how there's requirements in Canada for submitting your clinical trial data publicly.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that?
The regulators are also under pressure to provide transparency to the process to the general public, right? And so, whether it's Health Canada or I think it started in Europe, to be honest, but it's certainly since 2019, Health Canada publicly makes available the results of trials that have happened, right? And so it's accessible that it's there. And so when you start thinking about something like a COVID vaccine, I don't think there's a huge concern as it relates to being able to figure out who a particular patient was, because those are very, very large trials. But when you get into very specific disease states, there may only be 20 2,150, 250 citizens in Canada that may have that disease. So even just taking out their name, they're still identifiable, right? And so it needs to be a negotiation with the regulatory authority as to how do we make sure that we're protecting, how do we be transparent, but then also how do we make sure that we're still protecting privacy? And so it's a conversation every single time, right? And that conversation is going to take time.
It absolutely is. And I think for making data publicly available, that's something that the community is still learning a lot about. And it's very much one of those balances of privacy versus public interest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question.
So a little bit about what we can do to help at Private AI. Essentially, we take in multiple different file types to put in directly in your environment. We're able to identify the personal information that you have in those documents and text, images, video, audio, etc. And we can process it to give you an idea of what kind of personal information is in those documents, and then also de-identify according to your needs. So you get to say what kind of PHI you need to keep and what kind of PHI you want to remove. And the way that you can do that is, of course, with very high accuracy, because we focus so much on this problem specifically. It can also help with identifying corporate confidential information. And that corporate confidential information can be things like organization names that are being mentioned. We can integrate drug names, for example, if that's something that you don't want to make public. So there's a lot of data that you can automatically capture, either to strip out or to create as metadata, or to have a better understanding of the risk within your data itself. And the really cool thing about this is also that you have really minute control over how you deal with those values. So you can add labels like location city, or very specific ones like location and postal code. You can remove addresses, but keep provinces or states, one of the requirements of HIPAA Safe Harbor, for example. You can obfuscate the values with any character of choice. You can tokenize the values or encrypt the values based on using the encryption keys that you're currently, or your current encryption key system. So it's very easy to integrate as well. And you can also replace with synthetic personal information. So for example, a patient number might become another patient, a random patient number. And the interesting part there is that if you do that, and there's anything that ends up being missed, it becomes much more difficult to recognize what the fake data is from the original data. So the re-identification risk becomes lower.
This is some of the stuff that gets me really excited, right? Because when I look at this, when you're going actually even through the chat window, every time you do make a submission, you can see it tells you what's being redacted, right?
That's
So
right.
like, you are empowered and have control of what's being redacted, what hasn't been redacted, and you can play around with it, right?
That's right. And this very same technology is embedded into privacy layer for large language models. So if you are interacting with ChatGPT or Azure OpenAI, for example, or GPT-4, you have that control of what it is that you're sending to that third party, while still making sure that you get access to some of the best technology out there. And in addition to that, so I did mention that we do image de-identification. When it comes to DICOM images, for example, that's a growing demand that we've had in the healthcare space with a number of clients. And the requirements there have been removing personal information from the image itself, so the text in the image, but also really digging into the metadata and removing the personal information in the metadata itself. Metadata often gets ignored, but it's a very big risk of re-identification there. And we have many really important customers as part of our cohort of customers, including the CDC, Providence Health, we've been working with for years on HIPAA compliant chatbots. Kids Help Phone and Holmusk. We're honored that they trust us to de-identify data and do data discovery for them. And we're backed by really incredible folks like Microsoft's venture fund and so on. So if you're interested in finding out more about how to work with us, you can either contact Bruce on Narrative Group at info@narrativegroup.com or us at Private AI at info@private-ai.com. And we'll take questions that you may have. I'll leave a slide up here to let you get extra information if you'd like.
I think one of the things that's really key here is this seems to be like a really exciting technology, right? And so the thing that I'm always really passionate about is taking something like this and applying it to a real business use case, because I mean, this is a very technical topic, right? And ultimately it can really help solve a very big challenge in bringing new and innovative healthcare products to market.
Yeah, the reason it was because the even the very basics of privacy weren't being done right when it came to unstructured data, and that's what we're working on.
Yeah, which is great.
One question came in. Can you share 1 or 2 use cases for drug discovery?
You know, I mean, ultimately, every drug company out there has a compound database, and so whenever they make a decision in order to go after a specific disease state or disease problem, they're going to do some pretty amazing things in the lab, in the petri dishes, in the various different labs, in order to see whether they can get, you know, they're going to throw literally thousands of different compounds at a problem and see what happens. And so that's really the drug discovery process. But once they find a target and they're like, hey, wait a second, this could actually be something. Well, now you start to get into what we're really going to deal with, right? And so that's when you start to say, okay, well, you know, if I'm going after, I remember years ago I was in Laval at a laboratory. It was a level 3 containment lab, and they were actually level 4. They were dealing with HIV, and so they're in the labs. They're modeling HIV in 3D, and they're looking at how they're going to block the reproduction of HIV, and how, you know, they're doing all this kind of stuff. But once they find something, and in HIV, it was all about, you know, we can kill HIV, but we're also going to kill you, right? And so they want to find something where it kills the problem, but it doesn't kill you. And when they do that, now you get into the trial process. And I'm simplifying it, right? But now you get into the trial process. When you get there, now all of a sudden you're going to have to start to a point where you get to where you actually are going to have to use it on a human being. Now, when you're starting to use it on that human being, that's when privacy comes in. That's when it starts, right? And the more people you begin to use it with, the larger the problem becomes. So the further down the process you get, the larger the problem becomes. Now, the other thing, though, as well, is as you're collecting all that data, you know, all this, you know, all these AI tools that private AI can get in front of to de-identify things, it can help you analyze that data a lot quicker. You know, Patricia, I think you can talk about that more readily than I can. But, you know, if you have, you know, 10,000 patients in a trial, and you want to dissect and find the commonalities and find, you know, what are the things that could go wrong and why are they going wrong, I think AI is an excellent use case for being able to churn through that data and identify anomalies.
Yeah, to give a little bit more of an idea there, when it comes to clinical trial data, because the clock is ticking, right? But by the time you get to clinical trials, to getting to the drug on the market, and a lot of the time wasted can be through that de-identification process, with bad technologies that then you have to go and redo the de-identification afterwards. or with the amount of time that humans in the loop might take doing that de-identification. And so shortening that time period really helps in getting that drug to market faster and in a more privacy preserving way, because you're not relying on things like regular expressions, which don't generalize well on context in order to do that de-identification.
And like, I'll give you an example of that actually, right? Which is, years ago there was a drug that was trying to come to market. I'm not going to say the drug to protect everybody, but basically what was going on is it was a drug that would help with mental health. And it was one of the trials was being used with some teenagers, and sadly, somebody ended up passing away, right? And so that creates this incredible amount of scrutiny, which is completely deserved, right? And so you have to sit down and explain it, and you have to go through the data, right? And so I think this is one of those things where, being able to identify and re-identify what exactly happened, because a lot of what delayed that drug to market, because it is actually in market now, what delayed that drug getting to market was going through that analysis, was going through the data of what happened in the trial and how are we going to deal with it. And so I really think that private AI could really have accelerated demonstrating the integrity of the data.
Yeah, it's a great point, Bruce. And we've got a couple of other questions coming in. Is for private AI, do you work currently with companies in regions outside North America where privacy regulation isn't well defined and enforced? If so, how are you able to tackle the challenges they faced? If not, is that an area you would consider as they develop? So they're very global. We're very global. We cover places like Japan, Hong Kong, Australia, Brazil, Germany, UK, Canada, US, etc. And a lot of the places do have tighter privacy regulation, and that is why they come to us. We can help people tackle the challenges of privacy outside of those areas. That becomes more of a what kind of standard do they want to follow if it's not legislation that's being enforced onto them. When it comes to global legislation, of course, so the GDPR, for example, applies to folks worldwide as long as they're EU citizens. And so if you have a country that has lighter legislation, but you're processing an EU citizen's data, you still need to comply with the GDPR. What happens with healthcare legislation, it does tend to be very regional. So we'd have to look at location by location, what it is that the actual country's requirements are around that healthcare data. That being said, there are best practices when it comes to de-identification. One can follow an ISO standard on de-identification, for example. One can follow HIPAA safe harbor practices, or always get expert determination, regardless of whether or not the legislation requires you to, if you want to follow those best practices, which are encouraged. Hopefully that helps.
A question with respect to, does IRB accept the PHI de-identification tech when such tech can't guarantee 100% PHI removal, right? And so, my immediate reaction to a question like that would be, that's the whole point of CSV&C, right? And so private AI is making a claim that basically says that we can do this. And at the end of the day, if you can, that is a tremendous benefit. And so there may be some people who are willing and interested in order to test that, give it a try.
Yeah, and the best validation is definitely on your own data set, and we can work with you to make sure that it works at a very high standard there. We did get another question here. Can you please give some information about the implementation process of the privacy products in healthcare companies, assuming it would differ in each project and requirements, but I'm interested in the process and time frame of the implementation. So the process is we send a container to you and you deploy that in your environment directly. And that container runs as a REST API, and then you send through your data through that REST API. And out comes the de-identified data and the list of personal information that was found. So you get to choose whether you're using it for data discovery or whether you're using it for de-identification. And ideally, during the process, what we're doing is going through a subsample of your data to make sure that it is working properly for your particular use case. If there's anything to be tuned, we get de-identified examples from our customers to see where things went wrong and provide an updated model within 2 weeks or a month, depending on the complexity of the task. And then once we are confident that it's working well in your data, you're off to the races.
And the only thing I would add on to Patricia's answer is the Narrative Group is an organization with some good healthcare experience in the background that can certainly work in combination with private AI in order to help you get to market and prove things out in an appropriate fashion. We do have CSV and C experience, and so we can help you through that process in concert with private AI.
Yeah, we're very lucky to be partnering with the Narrative Group for this. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. All right, take care.
Yeah.